be applicable to other countries of Council of Europe, where some of you are working with. So the two speakers we have with us are Ula Alexandra Kas and Aysel Kuchuksu. Did I say it right? Good. I don't know in which order you would like to speak.
Mixed.
Okay, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad this works. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so good afternoon. It's so good being here. We are happy to present our work. We are here representing the Human Rights Nudge up there. It is a iCourt stationed project led by Veronica Fikfak. And this is moving beyond my control. Okay, it's fine. Yes, and in a broader sense, the project investigates compliance and implementation of European Court of Human Rights judgment, but in a slightly alternative way, very not in a typically legal studies way. And I'll talk about this in a bit, in a short while. But before going there, I want to say that we are here to present our findings that relate to three states, as it was mentioned before, but the project is planning to expand past those states and investigate also other states in the future. So you are very much invited to follow us on our website. And how we'll do this is that I'll first talk about the methodology that we use. So just to explain you how it works, what we found, and so you can assess if the findings are good and convincing. Then Aysel will talk about the importance of civil society, and then she will touch briefly upon the case of Denmark as the really exemplary complier, and speak about Slovenia and Hungary and compare them and their actions and how they behave before the court, and then how the NGOs, which we interviewed in those states, react to that. Right. About the methodology, the project is sort of approaches the investigation in two parts. One part is the quantitative analysis of the information that we got from HUDOC, the official database of the court, which literally just means that we are taking these pieces of information on every adverse judgment that was ever rendered against the three states and the more states that we are looking into. For instance, when the judgment was rendered, how long the state needed for the case to be complied with, how many victims were there, and things like that. And then we conduct statistical analysis on that to see if there are some inconsistencies or just to get the general image on how the state behaves. And to this, we add qualitative analysis, which again consists of three parts. One is that we look into the documentation that was submitted internationally, so government communication, your typical Rule 9 communications and everything that's connected there. Then we look into the specific state, into its domestic context, for instance, the parliamentary discussions, media reports, scholarly reports, literally everything that we can find on every judgment that has ever been rendered. And then we conduct interviews to try results, we say, which literally just means to test what we found and to understand the broader picture. And this is the methodology. And here we would just want to emphasize that we see beyond the Rule 9 submissions and also kind of try to comprehensively assess how the state is behaving. And now I will give the floor to Aysel before returning to this floor again.
Hi, everyone. Oops, Ula's very tall. So, as you can read, our conclusion, and I'm sure that everybody in the room agrees, is that there's a huge potential for NGO and NHRI involvement in the implementation process before the court. And we have summarized, as George asked us to do so, 4 things that you can do according to us. So actions you might consider is submitting a Rule 9 communication, taking an informal dialogue with the Committee of Ministers, taking a dialogue with EU institutions or other institutions that the state you're concerned with is a member of, or inciting mass litigation. I will touch upon point 1, and Ulla will discuss point 2, 3, and 4. And as an NGO, I'm sure you can submit a Rule 9 communication. And what I did as part of my research was to read all the Rule 9 communications that have ever been submitted before the court, so around 1,000 of them. It took me a long time, and I got like an injury in my wrist coding all of them. But I think I had some interesting findings, and they were basically that you can use a Rule 9 communication to serve 4 general purposes. The first one is to start a genuine dialogue between the Committee of Ministers and the state you're interested in. And I say a genuine dialogue because action reports and action plans don't always reflect genuine engagement on part of the state. So what you can do is you can draw the Committee of Ministers' attention to repetitions in an action plan or things that are not working, or even say to them that the state still hasn't submitted an action plan on a particular case. So we know from Moldova that they have been quite successful in drawing the Committee of Ministers' attention to the fact that in the case of Iordache and others against Moldova, there had gone 7 years since the final judgment before any action plan was submitted. So this is one thing to consider when you're submitting a Rule 9. And it's also a good way to get information that you might not be getting at the national level. So you can in your Rule 9 submission, you can make a point of information that you're needing, that you're not getting, and request it via your Rule 9. Now, I don't know how successful that will be, but of course it's worth trying. A second point is that you could contextualize the measures that are submitted by the state as a means of implementations, because you could here I'm standing on research from scholars in the room, so this corroborated by research from other scholars as well. I just had the empirical angle to it. Basically, the Committee of Ministers has limited sources and not a lot of time to check every claim that is made by a nation state. So here your voice is very valuable to bring context to the effectiveness of the measures, to their relevance. And 2 particular ways you can do that is by drawing attention to how they might work on paper versus how they actually would work in practice, and any discrepancies there. Or you could argue that an issue is systemic rather than isolated, because we see very often that states are very keen on arguing that an issue is an isolated case. And even in the case of Denmark, which is an exemplary complier on paper, they would there is this desire to draw an issue as an isolated issue, but now we see that with NGO involvement, we learned that some issues are actually represent systematic problems in the country that have been going on for decades. The third thing you could do is to offer pragmatic solutions. So if you feel like you know how a judgment would best be implemented, a great thing to do is to try and set the agenda for reform by saying how you think a judgment would best be implemented. Here, your points could also fit into the debate behind closed doors at the Committee of Ministers. You never know. So, and ask, and it also could help different member states to ask each other meaningful questions. So it's a very, very good way to go about it. And last but not least, you could request the escalation of a procedure. We learned now that we don't know what happens when the Committee of Ministers decides to enhance the supervision of a case, but it's always worth going there if you believe that a case should be supervised under the enhanced procedure, because cases under an enhanced supervision procedure get a lot more airtime, and this also gives you time to join the conversation. And here again, it's very useful if you can say that an issue is of a systemic rather than an isolated nature. Again, we don't know what's the most convincing argument for the Committee of Ministers, but I would assume that providing evidence that an issue has been going on for years and not been addressed would be a great way to go about it. And last but not least, as a summary, one could say that the overarching result is to keep the international supervision of a case ongoing. And there you engage with the reputation of a state. Some states don't like to have cases open for a long time. And we see also in their efforts and how they reply to Rule 9 that they're trying to argue for the closure of a case as soon as possible. And then you can also have, this allows you to space to articulate a vision for how our judgment should be implemented. Now, I wanted to use this to move on to how Denmark has been doing, because it's an exemplary compliance, and people could wonder whether it's at all relevant to hear NGO or NHRI voices when we're talking about exemplary compliance. And the short answer is that yes, that's very much important. One reason is because the closure of a case is both kind of a pragmatic act, but also a symbolic act. Committee of Ministers, they don't have enough resources to double check what states are saying. So in a way, whenever they are closing cases, they are also entrenching the reputation of a state. So states with a reputation that's not as good would have their cases open for longer, but states like Denmark that have a very good reputation, I think that it would require a bit more before their submissions are put under scrutiny. So there is a role to play for you in alleviating such biases. And in particular, a great example of this is the Agerholm case, which is currently one of two cases, Danish cases open before the Committee of Ministers. And it's a case about a restraint with a belt of a psychiatric patient. And the Danish government has argued that it's an isolated case, but actually it's an issue in Danish psychiatry that's been ongoing for 20 years. And it's a huge issue, it's all over national media. And Denmark has never, in the 15 years that we've had the Rule 9 opportunity, Denmark has never, no Danish NGO has ever submitted a Rule 9 communication until this year in the Agerholm case, where they brought evidence to show, actually, wait a minute, don't close this case, make it under enhanced supervision because we have a systemic issue here. And I think that that's fantastic. And I think that you should, even if you're coming from a jurisdiction that has exemplary compliance, or you're interested in an issue in a jurisdiction that's an exemplary complier, because hey, you can always submit a Rule 9 against a state that you're not related to. Remember that there's a place for you to influence the conversation. And now I give the microphone back to Ulla.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we are moving from the broader perspective to the concrete cases, so to the more technical aspect of our presentation, where I want to address how the two states, namely Slovenia and Hungary, behave before the court, and we will show you this through our findings, and then how the NGOs in those countries react to that, and then we'll address the key lessons that can be drawn from that. But before going into that, I just want or I will address this question: is civil society involved even in those cases? And the answer is yes, and we can see it through this. I'm sorry, this one, yeah, this is okay. Right, so this is what we call social network analysis, where we mapped out every particular actor that was ever involved in implementation of the cases against Slovenia. And the size of the bubbles indicates the intensity of that. So in the intensity of interaction this particular actor has with other actors that participate in implementation. And as you can see, and was also previously addressed today, the Ministry of Justice has a central role in Slovenia, in specific this project group that is responsible for coordinating implementation. But what we could also see is that the blue dots are the NGOs, so the civil society organizations that participate in that process too. And in particular, in Slovenia, there is still room for a dialogue between the civil society and the state. We are not saying that it's being used or that it's being fruitful, but there is this possibility. To the contrary, Hungary also has many implementing actors, and the biggest one is, again, the Human Rights Department, which is responsible for the coordination and has a disputed role in the implementation itself. But the important part of this image is that there's several NGOs and several human rights organizations that also participate in that. And what we found when we looked into Hungary is that those the civil society cannot really access the state, so they cannot engage in a dialogue with the state, at least in the past 10 years or so. Now to the results, so the quantitative part, which I talked about earlier of our analysis, which surfaced two specific findings with respect to Slovenia. And this one, the first one is that Slovenia is sensitive to monetary incentives, meaning that the higher the compensation award before the court, the faster Slovenia will pay it, so the shorter the time to payment. And the second finding with respect to Slovenia was that it is very much concerned about its international reputation, meaning that it puts a lot of effort into presenting itself as a valuable member of the Council of Europe. And then while we found that the compensation awards against Hungary have increased in the post-2010 period, we also find that Hungary is not sensitive to monetary incentives, which means basically that the state does not respond to the court's compensation awards. And equally, we have learned through interviews that the state is not really concerned about its international reputation. But what it is concerned about is its EU benefits. As George previously mentioned, this is a great incentive that can really incentivize states into compliance. And with this knowledge, we then went into the interviews, where we learned about several tactics of the Slovenian and Hungarian NGOs. For instance, in Slovenia, the civil society puts a lot of emphasis on the formal dialogue with the Committee of Ministers, meaning through Rule 9 communications, but also engages in an informal dialogue. And there was this particular case of Kuric, where one of the most visible NGOs in Slovenia actually assisted the victims to literally go to Strasbourg and literally attend one of the informal meetings where their view was also presented. And then in Hungary, we learned that NGOs exert pressure through mass litigation, which literally means that they collect applicants with similar applications, and they kind of enable them to bring their cases before the court to incentivize monetary, sort of culminate the monetary awards against the state. And this kind of clashes with our findings that Hungary is not really sensitive to that. Then Hungarian NGOs also engage in a Rule 9 dialogue, but in contrary to the Slovenian ones, they are only accessing it through the formal channel of Rule 9 communications. And then the third one, which is, as we find, very important and a very important idea, especially in Hungary, because it is concerned about its EU membership, is the dialogue with the European Commission, and especially this rule of law, reports where the NGOs report how many ECtHR judgments are not implemented. And based on this, we can repeat the key lessons that we have found through our analysis of these two specific cases. One is the Rule 9 communications, which are, of course, the key and the core of the dialogue between the civil society and the Committee of Ministers. The second one is the informal dialogue with the Committee of Ministers. And here we are not trying to say that everyone should pack their applicants and bring them to Strasbourg. We are merely saying that there is an opportunity to open this informal dialogue with the Committee of Ministers, which is there and is really, in so many cases, NGOs have reported that the representatives were really helpful and really trying to see also the other side. Then the third one is the dialogue with the EU, which is, at least in my opinion, of a growing importance, at least because this mechanism has been established. We do not yet know how it's going to work or whether it's going to work, but it seems like a promising solution. And the fourth one is the mass litigation, which might not be working in terms of monetary incentives in Hungary, but it is very important because it kind of brings cases before the court, which then decides that there has been a violation, and it brings this violation to the international forum, and it sort of shows that the state is violating people's rights and that it's doing this in a large scale, so in a systemic manner. And oh yes, Aisal is showing me. We have prepared this leaflet, which is just a proposal of a few key bullet points, and you can find it back there if you're interested in just concrete, specific suggestions that we have made. And I think we are gonna finish early because we have presented 20 minutes together, not each, but I guess you appreciate that after lunch. So thank you so much for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much to both of you. So perhaps we're going to have a quick round of Q&A before we move to our next panel speaker. Okay.
Sorry. My name is Beril Önder, and I'm a PhD student in Ghent University, and also I'm working for the TLSP, Turkey Human Rights Litigation Support Project. It's really interesting, your presentations. Thank you very much. I would like to just ask, so I saw on one of the charts that you actually looked for a correlation between payment of the just satisfaction and also the involvement of the other actors. I was just wondering whether you could also just like do something similar, for instance, when we are talking about amendment of law, when we are talking about a systematic problem, and when there is another, when there is a general measure necessary, actually.
Thank you. Yes, you are right. So the correlations we were measuring for now were time to payment, which is in days, and then time to compliance. And this was the kind of a dependent variable, and then we tested this against, for instance, compensation award, the number of the victims, the article violated. So this was one part. And then the other part was just coding whether there was, or which type of measures were submitted to the Committee of Ministers. And this is a different type of, it's also been coded and it's also been statistically analyzed, but we have not really measured the correlation between the variables because I don't think we can see anything from that, but we have a general overview over that. And we also have specifically tried to distinguish between the measures that were actually reported and then also adopted. So we distinguish between compliance and implementation and try to see the general picture on that. And also with respect to legislation, we're trying to see whether the state has just submitted an existing legislation or whether it has actually adopted new legislation as a consequence of the judgment.
Thank you. So question from John from, sorry if I mispronounce your name, Pashak, good, and from Stefanos.
I think it's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you know more and have had more thoughts than you've been able to communicate today. And I'd love to pick your brains much more and your data. One question was, and I'm not convinced that it would actually be useful or tell you anything interesting, but have you, presumably you could, because you have the data, tried to correlate those activities with outcomes on the metric that you're measuring, just at the top line statistical overview? Like, what's the correlation between those 4 strategies and outcomes? One, would that be revealing, or would that actually not tell you anything because there are too many other things going on? 2, have you done it? Could you do it?
I think that's a great idea, but the project as it is right now focuses on the states. So we're trying to see the state perspective, how the state could be nudged into it. And the NGO involvement is just an extra that comes kind of on top of that. So, I mean, we could code all this. It would take probably an extra year.
I mean, it would just be interesting how much does, because you've got data on it, Rule 9 communications contribute to different outcomes. What percentage of them are close to ones where it's never happened at all? So it'd be just quite interesting.
I think it could be, yeah, because we have the data on whether the Rule 9 has been submitted, and we have the data that whether the case has been closed or not. But the issue, I would say, is also that Rule 9s are submitted to cases that are not really closed. So there's an issue because the lack of data, right? We don't have the data on whether the case has been closed, but I think it's an interesting aspect.
I'll follow up with you afterwards. Fascinating stuff, great work.
There you have your idea for the next research project.
Would you give me a grant?
We could help. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I think I have 2 comments, and I think the second one is a question, maybe. So the first comment is just being an EIN member. So the second question will be more of an academic, so I want to separate them. On the first one, I think in our EIN work on the Rule 9 submissions, we see this move of presenting this case as an isolated case by governments very frequently. So I don't think it's a Danish story. I think it's a very important story, and it's something that we all, as EIN members and network members and everyone, when we look into the Rule 9s, we have to think really systematically. It's become a very common move or a tactic to say this is an isolated case. And of course, then almost the NGOs have to say it's not, right? I mean, because you have to then put all the evidence, the time to say it's not. And I think this is a big point. I just wanted to comment on that. The second one is more of an academic comment. Sorry, maybe it's a bit too academic-y, but I have a lot of interest in Denmark and its implementation record in the field of asylum and migration. And I study Denmark both in relation to the European Court and all of the United Nations Human Rights Committees. And Denmark's effective and full implementation of judgments in the field of asylum and migration is not exemplary, quote unquote, or with a quote or without a quote. So, presenting Denmark as a case, an exemplary case, I just want to sort of, for me, my data would say, actually no. And I think it ties in with this isolated versus systemic issues. So a lot of the deportation, criminal, long-term, incredibly long-term migrants and their deportation, family reunification, it's being used as a threat to actually people leaving Denmark and moving somewhere else. So there's a huge amount of problems. So when we say a good complier, I think there's a big question about compliance with exactly what, right? So I think this is a big thing that we should discuss. And it may be a small problem is a lot of the asylum and migration court judgments that come from the European Court of Human Rights are coming what a lot of scholars now call procedural review. So the court is sort of saying, oh, you should sort of procedurally improve the procedure. So it never sort of says something substantive about violations. And of course, procedural review judgments from Strasbourg lead to very little to do kind of messaging by the government saying something is isolated. And then if the Danish, as you say, the society is not that involved, that means a closed case, and then the numbers look really shiny. So I think as both academics and people who work on implementation, we have to dig much, much deeper. And I think that's, for me, like a really big finding about Denmark and its story. And the only implementation bit I know about Denmark is asylum and migration. And the story is really troubling in terms of systemic non-implementation, would be kind of my view based on the cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Bashak.
Would you like to?
Yes, please. So on the first point, yes, I'm sorry if this wasn't clear, but it's absolutely one of the big dichotomies, isolated case versus a systemic issue. States, in all their replies or in their action plans, first they say, this is an isolated case, let's close it, don't enhance. And then states, NGOs come in and say, actually, it's a systemic issue. Here are statistics, here are interviews, here are all these reports from our domestic jurisdiction that show that it's a systemic issue. So I think that that's a very strong dichotomy that came out from reading all the Rule 9s, and it's not just applicable to Denmark, but across the board. And I thought that I should also point out to the two other dichotomies. One was, again, NGOs trying to say, okay, these measures look good enough on paper, but actually in practice they don't work because of this. We have this other law that blocks this law from actually being effective. So it's very important that you're able to contextualize the measures that are proposed or by the state in how they would work domestically, if they would at all work domestically. And the last one is, again, states, it goes hand in hand with this presenting an issue as an isolated case. They also say, let's close it. And then you see NGOs saying, well, let's not only not close it, but bring it under enhanced supervision. So there's a huge discrepancy there, because by virtue of it being systemic issue, it would require enhanced supervision. And then states are saying, no, it's an isolated issue and we should close this supervision once and for all. So that was also a big dichotomy that came out from reading the Rule 9s. Whenever states ask for closing a case, it's worth checking whether it's not a bigger issue than you might think. And on Denmark, I didn't mention migration in the presentation, but it was supposed to be part of it. I just forgot. But again, I'm writing on Denmark, and I'm actually facing a lot of fire for calling Denmark an exemplary complier. But if you see Denmark in the context of all Council of Europe member states, it stands out both in how few cases reach the Court of Human Rights and how quickly they get implemented. And I think that doesn't make them exemplary. It makes them exemplary compared to the others, but I think this is more a symptom of a problem with the system and how we accept compliance. And what implementation means, and the fact that NGOs have and the Danish Institute for Human Rights have a problem with how judgments get implemented, but they've never submitted a Rule 9 until 3 months ago. So there's a conversation to be had about the space there is for NGOs, again, to get involved and to say just because a state has an excellent reputation doesn't mean we have to take its word for it. And absolutely, Denmark is now pushing a lot of migration legislation, saying explicitly in the preparatory works, we're going to run this little process risk of getting overturned at the European Court of Human Rights, but we were going to go with it anyway. Then this legislation applies to people for 5 years, 10 years before it reaches the court. And in all this time, the rights of people get jeopardized. And then these cases then, recently there was a judgment called MA, which arose from legislation like this, where the words process risk were explicitly mentioned in the preparatory works, and it was found, the legislation was found to be in breach of Article 8. But still, all the harm that was caused to the applicants cannot be taken back just because now there's a judgment by the court. So it's important that before a case is closed, the NGOs get involved and draw attention, the Committee of Ministers' attention to even these exemplary compliers.
Thank you, Aysel. I think Daniel is getting a little impatient there. So maybe quickly, 2 questions, one from Stefanos and one from you, and then we move to Daniel.
Yes. Thank you very much. So I think that you mentioned earlier on NGOs submitting an alternative implementation plan as part of an Article 9 submission. And in the morning, we heard that perhaps, we should try to anticipate things, and we should try to get the NGOs involved at the domestic level already at the stage when the implementation plan is prepared by the authorities. And of course, this is the best case scenario. But let's take another case scenario whereby the authorities don't want to consult the NGOs at the earlier stage. I mean, what do you think? Is there room for civil society to take its own initiative, to start, creating implementation plans already before the state submits its own? How do we build capacity for this so as to enable NGOs, to try to influence things at the domestic level with parliaments, etc.? I'm just, trying to think of how we go about, the bad guys, the countries that don't want to involve NGOs, and in situations where we don't want to wait until it is too late, until the implementation plan is already submitted.
Well, actually, Alice and Anne have excellent work on this, showing how in Georgia, NGOs have been so consistent in submitting particular measure for implementation that in the end, even though it wasn't the same measure as the one submitted by the government, it kind of became the benchmark for implementation. It was in cases of violence against LGBT demonstrators where the police just didn't get involved, and the measures concerned suggested giving training, a bias training to the police force, and eventually it became the benchmark for implementation. So I think that there's always room for saying that this wouldn't work because of this and this and this reason, as long as you support it with evidence, and this would perhaps work better. And then there's all this like lobby work around that, and also informal communication with the Committee of Ministers, deputies that you can take on and discuss why this measure would be better or not. I'm sure also George has excellent ways of going about it. But I think, yes, there's room for going for it, even if the government doesn't listen to you when they first draft an action plan.
Thank you, Aisel. And Alice.
Yes, I'll be really quick. Sorry, I know we're short of time. I have two very quick questions. One was, on your wonderful social network analysis, I didn't see a very big blob for Parliament, and I didn't see many lines joining the blue NGOs too. So just to the parliamentary blob, as it were. So just be interested to get your reflections on that. And the second one was a slightly bigger question. So that obviously there are many different sort of competing theoretical explanations for why states comply or don't. And I know we're not really here to discuss theory as such, but one approach, for example, that Andreas von Staden has taken is to see a compliance pull that states, generally at least, don't want to be seen to be bad compliers. So there's a kind of reputational and among other factors that pull them towards compliance. But then a kind of rational choice kicks in and they comply as minimally as possible to get over the line. And I wondered if your research was able to kind of factor in that it is also sometimes called partial compliance. And obviously in the Committee of Ministers system that there is no such thing. A case is pending and then it's closed and it's either one or the other. But we know in reality it can be more messy and that cases can be closed when they might be judged to have been really minimally or too minimally implemented with, say, an administrative change rather than a legislative one. So I just wanted to, as a general question, if your research was able to factor in that kind of minimalist or partial compliance theory, as it were.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you so much thank you so much. Both of the questions are very relevant. And I will start with the Parliament. In both networks, it didn't really surface as that important, I think, because it's kind of the final actor that really, kicks in when everything is prepared, when there are initiatives, when there is a proposal, and then it's either adopt the legislation or not. And this is sort of what we coded. And NGO to Parliament, at least in Slovenia, it does not really go that way. And I think also in Hungary, but I think people know more about this than me. But yeah, I mean, as a legislative organ, I think it should have a bigger role, but it did not surface as such in these cases. And then the second one, strategies of compliance, of course. We are trying to look into that, and we've done this by sort of placing compliance on a spectrum. So it's not really, because it's especially with liberal states, for instance, because we have this dichotomy between liberal, for instance, Slovenia and the West, typical, and then Hungary, Poland as a Central Eastern marginalized region. And then we found that in liberal states, there's this compliance spectrum where basically none of the judgments are non-implemented. So something always happens, but it depends on what the gravity is and what the measures are. So we're trying to sort of place the measures and the effectivity of them on this spectrum. And we've done that in Slovenia because we had a good insight into that. We are working on that in Hungary because it's much more difficult. Because Hungary, as it is right now, it also considers non-compliance, right? And this is a whole new world that is out there and is to be researched. So we are trying to also look into that. But yeah, Andreas Verstappen, I mean, his work is very influential for us, I would say.
Thank you, Ula. I think the number of questions that you received shows the relevance of the topic of your research. Yes?
A quick moment to plug the Faces of Implementation series on the EIN on the webpage. And I think it really, I mean, the quantitative and statistical analysis does an incredible job at sort of showing the scope and the patterns. But just to plug that series, there are a number of really in detail reflections and case studies of civil society representatives talking about exactly these kinds of questions. So when do you want a case closed? When is it advantageous to keep it open? How do you know? What do you look for? What are the different institutional mechanisms by which you can get involved in being part of an implementation plan? How do you set those sort of stages up? So just a plug for the series. There are a few up there now. There are a couple more coming out, I think, in the next few weeks. And some of that very granular, specific case study information, I think, helps people get a sense of how do you make these calls, when do you make these calls, and so it's a really nice complement to the work you guys are doing.
Yeah, I can only agree that EIN resources are extremely helpful, very practical, and if there is anyone in this room who hasn't yet explored those, I highly advise you do. Our next speaker is Daniel Holder. Daniel is the Deputy Director of the Committee of the Administration of Justice based in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And Daniel is going to talk about issue of implementation concerning grievous human rights violations during the times of trouble. And unfortunately, we see more and more trouble in the European region lately. So Daniel's intervention is very timely and relevant. Daniel, please.
Thank you very much. So we are a human rights NGO, and the troubles in question refer to the Northern Ireland conflict and the patterns of human rights violations that were there, that yes, do have a tendency of being repeated. I aim to talk through our strategies. Now, I'm not sure how different our strategies are to everyone else's, but hopefully there'll be something. The particular group of cases I'm going to focus on is called the McCurr group of cases, or the cases concerning the actions of the security forces in Northern Ireland that were taken by ourselves and others back in 2001, 2003, and obviously reflected a much broader systemic issue during the conflict that related to the failures to investigate, i.e. the procedural limb of Article 2, killings by the state during the conflict, either direct killings or where there was a suspicion of state involvement in paramilitary killings. And the outworkings of those cases were general measures to put in place investigative mechanisms. Now, on the face of it, I suppose could be argued that our strategy hasn't been very good, and that's for two reasons. I'll argue the opposite, but it could be argued on face value. First of all, and I don't know if this is a record, but the cases are still before the execution of judgments unit 20 years on, still not fully implemented. And The second reason is that although in 2014 we reached a new bilateral agreement between the British and Irish governments and parties on a set of new mechanisms that would meet Article 2 requirements and would replace what was there under the general measures, we're not in a good place with it at the moment. Last year, the UK government, British government, unilaterally abandoned that agreement and instead put forward a proposal for an amnesty that's actually greater in scope than General Pinochet's amnesty was, and has now proceeded at this moment to rush legislation through the UK Parliament to shut down all investigative mechanisms that were there under the general measures. And without downplaying the awfulness of that particular situation at present, paradoxically, it is actually a measure of success of the implementation of general measures in recent years that the UK now wants to shut them all down, whereas we had reached a place whereby, yes, it was a running battle to get them implemented, but they were really beginning to work and they were really beginning to deliver significant amounts of historical clarification and information recovery that was delivering a measure of resolution for families, but also playing towards broader human rights goals. Just quickly on some contextual background, we had the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which is the sort of culmination of the peace process. That the protagonists in the armed conflict were the Irish Republican armed groups, the IRA and others, British loyalist paramilitary groups, and then the security forces, the army and militarized police. The types of patterns of human rights violations that fueled the conflict were state killings with concerns around impunity for them. I mean, most military cases weren't actually police investigated at all, particularly in the early part. Patterns of the use of torture, the sort of 5 techniques that were originally the subject of the Ireland versus the UK case that we did, actually pressed to try and get reopened relatively recently. And then thirdly, patterns of what the court has termed collusion, whereby units of the security forces colluded with paramilitary organizations in terms of killings and other human rights violations, either informally, sort of weapons going missing, or in a more institutionalized way through the use of state informants within such groups. Now, the official truth of the state has been a number of things. One is that most state killings were lawful, something easier to sustain when you don't investigate them, and also that paramilitary collusion is either a myth or is indeed isolated, to use the term that was used earlier on. And the thing is that independent investigations have somehow unpicked that official truth and made it difficult to sustain, which has obviously contributed to goals of truth and justice, as well as non-recurrence. And it's not just about us, obviously, non-recurrence of those same strategies by UK forces and another place, Iraq and torture being an obvious example. In terms of what was in the Good Friday Agreement on this, yes, it had things, conflict resolution things on things like disarmament, demilitarization, policing and justice reform, prison release, but it had no transitional justice mechanism at all. It did commit to the incorporation of the European Convention into Northern Ireland law, which happened and was absolutely transformational and is being unpicked pretty much as we speak at the moment. That's why we then at that stage took the Article 2 cases that established the procedural jurisprudence of Article 2 in terms of the investigative steps the state has to go through. The outworkings of that in general measures were piecemeal, but were welcome. At that time, there was nothing that would have had sufficient independence to actually conduct Article 2 compliant investigations. The outworking was there were changes to civil legal inquests, there were changes to independent police teams, there were changes to the police complaints mechanism that had been established as a result of the peace process, so it could look at things retrospectively. And this provided some sort of infrastructure at an individual case level to conduct Article 2 compliant investigations. That was very heavily impeded by the UK and was a constant running battle between civil society, ourselves, lawyers, victims, others, and state agencies. And that's why actually the long-term supervision of the Committee of Ministers and the strategy of keeping that going is actually a good thing that it was there for so long, because it managed to keep mechanisms in check. And our strategy, I suppose, was twofold. One was to work to make sure that the package of measures, the general measures, was properly implemented. But secondly, also, and we did develop at various times very good relations with state officials on this, was to develop a replacement set of transitional justice institutions that would do the job in a more comprehensive manner. And one of the things that we did do in that front, when an agreement, the 2014 agreement called the Stormont House Agreement, was finally reached, we looked at the long, fairly consistent tradition that the British government had during the peace process of signing up to agreements and then producing implementation legislation that looked rather different to what was in the agreements. And one of the strategies we used was to devise our own model implementation bill with an academic team as a way of trying to ensure that that wouldn't happen. And there was a measure of success in that, and the ultimate draft legislation that was produced to implement that particular agreement before it was abandoned by the current UK government. We always felt the international pressure on the UK government, and the constant supervision of the Committee of Ministers was helpful. For us, for a start, it was one of the only ways of actually drawing out what the government's position was on particular aspects of general measures, putting in the Rule 9 submission, waiting for the defence, and getting the response. We did find, I know the current UK government may be unembarrassable, but that hasn't always been the case, and the international reputation and previous times did mean something to them, which created greater leverage in using those types of submissions. The Rule 9s were also a real place to give real detailed evidence that the Secretariat and others would not have had access to had we been not able to provide it. What we did do, one of the strategies we did was we wanted to make sure that we could produce very, very highly credible expert submissions that would be the go-to submissions that others would follow. And we felt we couldn't really do that on our own as a small NGO. And the way we did it ultimately, and continue to do it actually, is through an academic partnership where we have a number of legal academics and we work as a team. Actually call ourselves the Model Bill team because of that model bill we collectively produced. But that's been another way of opening other doors, both to funding and also to access and other platforms to give sort of greater credibility to the work. A lot of the work, in fact, has involved building alliances with other organizations, including the European Implementation Network, whose assistance has been invaluable in terms of getting a different sort of in Strasbourg. Of course, there's litigation strategies and engaging with independent lawyers and others as well, of which we have a network, because that's been one of the techniques used when there is a sham investigation by one of the general measures where things haven't been properly implemented, either because of a lack of independence or because there's a delay in investigation because the state has removed the funding or diminished the funding for a mechanism. Domestic litigation, particularly using the incorporation of the ECtHR, has been a major strand of that work, as is using the oversight mechanisms that were established under the peace process. They have been quite essential when general measures, some of the piecemeal mechanisms that were set up have strayed outside of their mandate in terms of conducting Article 2 compliant investigations. Like others, obviously, we'd work with victims organizations, putting human stories in the media, keeping the issue prominent, and it's very prominent within the jurisdiction, not so much outside of it. Another strand of work that's involved other NGOs has been digging in the archives. It was amazing what the British government had actually accidentally left in the archives. In fact, that was the basis in seeking to reopen the Ireland versus the UK torture case, when it became very clear the UK had lied to the court and helpfully left some documents explaining that in the National Archive in London. Obviously, access to such archives is getting a little tighter now, but it was a useful mechanism. There's the internationalization of the work as well, and the use of the UN mechanisms that we've found very helpful. Again, like human rights defenders in many jurisdictions were constantly demonized, accused of bias, etc. Getting points of view legitimized by international actors has been extremely important to us. So there's, I suppose, some of the strategies, obviously, with the context of being able to work with political parties and the Irish government as well as a key partner within the peace process that can also make interventions on these issues. So in terms of where we're at, we're in obviously a very difficult situation at the moment with that legislation being pushed through. But in the interim, the strategies have at least squeezed quite a lot of drops of truth out of the state mechanisms, have provided a measure of resolution. And what that's led to is it's now not tenable to credibly deny that these patterns of human rights violations took place. And that actually leaves us in a better position to get on with the new challenge of this new legislation that's being pushed through. So that's some of the things we've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Yes, as someone who comes from Eastern Europe and who knows very little about, history of that part of the world, paradoxically, I find out more about Irish history through the ECtHR judgments and related stuff. Questions to Daniel before we go to the World Cafe format? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, it's just a question about the beginning of the presentation and how you ended. So these cases are from 2001, and by all means, it's 2 decades of work. But in a way, the way that you ended the talk was that you weren't that worried maybe about the length of time as such because of the huge amounts of developments and what you said about this really important thing that you were able to squeeze drops of truth, and that was what this process was about. So I just wanted to come back and say, because sometimes time is always discussed as a big issue. Do you have a different take on that because you're really dealing with sort of this really truth acknowledgement and truth-seeking processes, which are also relevant to lots of other jurisdictions, because there are lots of pending cases also in relation to Turkey, for example.
Okay, thank you.
It's on.
No, we're not overly concerned in that sense about the length of time because the continued international supervision has been helpful in keeping a constant watch on changes and practices and implementation. But it is partly due to the context that the general measures were seen in some senses as temporary and transitional, and that there were negotiations, almost endless negotiations, about their replacement with a more comprehensive transitional justice mechanism. So therefore, the supervision has continued in the sense that there has been no closure to the general measures until an agreement was implemented. And we did come very close. I mean, it is so near yet so far, but we did come very close to the implementation of a credible transitional justice mechanism, which maybe would have a stage if it had been allowed. In fact, had it been implemented shortly after it was agreed in 2014, it would actually probably be concluding its work at this stage, and therefore you could have looked at closure. But that these are real, because there are ongoing violations here in relation to the failures to investigate some of the most serious matters, continued supervision has been welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. And then question from the audience.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. I saw one really good, I have one comment and one question. I think that it sounds like you were doing a lot of things to corroborate evidence about things happening. And I think that that's a great strategy to try to extract different actors contributing with evidence so that in the end, as you say, the government couldn't credibly deny that human rights violations had happened. And I think that's something that the room could also consider as a great tactic. We see it also a lot in whenever we're talking about eventually proving that torture was taking place in Syria or in other conflict zones, that now people are just trying to corroborate evidence so that eventually people can be brought to justice. And I think that's a great strategy. But something that really caught my attention was that you mentioned that you've built alliances with academics, and that has allowed you to tap into different sources of monetary help. And I think that that's also, I would love to hear more about that, because to us, we're constantly being sold this as academics, this necessity of making our research kind of have real life impact. But we don't talk enough about how we can actually collaborate with NGOs to do that. And I would love to hear how you went about it and what you gained out of it.
Yeah, in terms of that, and I suppose we had a bit of an advantage in that a lot of our board members would be academics who've been engaged in this for a long time. So that was the starting point. But it is precisely that strand of impact funding that we've been able to tap into as an NGO partner with academic colleagues to produce we produced a piece of research initially that was called The Apparatus of Impunity, which as the title suggests was a critique of where things had gone, but also we were then able to use that funding, and important for us as an organization that doesn't take state money for obvious reasons. We were then able to use that to do things like the Model Implementation Bill and other things. So it did open other doors, and it was in relation to that issue that there were tangible policy impacts on policy and legislation and the general debate because of that.
I think we're going to take just last question because we're a little bit running out of time. I apologize.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Konstantin Ziktsirov. I'm a professor of human rights law at the University of Liverpool. Two quick questions. First of all, the very, very first judgment of the European Court of Human Rights was somewhat connected with the troubles, Lawless versus Ireland. And here we are, 60 years later, we're still discussing, like the impact of the European Court of Human Rights on troubles in Northern Ireland. My question is, what does it say about the effectiveness of the European Court of Human Rights? And the second question related to that is, I know that we cannot hypothesize, but imagine if there was no European Court of Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. How do you think the situation in Northern Ireland changed? I mean, like, what do you see the different scenarios in what has happened in the last 12, 50, 60 years?
Thank you for the question. Daniel.
Thank you. In terms of both of the questions and the reflection on the effectiveness of the court, I think I can only return to what was said earlier on, that it is a real problem, that there's nothing in between an interim resolution and infringement proceedings. There really does need to be some other form of enforcement built in there, and let's pick up that discussion as to what that can be. I think that's really important from our perspective. We'd be in a very bad place in terms of the second question if there was no Strasbourg, no European Court, and no domestic incorporation of the ECtHR. It would have been very difficult to have any level of accountability from for what's happened in the past. We'd be reliant on other common law and various other things to do that. But most of what's been achieved has been thanks to the convention, and it's exactly what it was designed for.
Then we had someone before you. Maybe we could discuss it during the coffee break. Sorry, John. I just want to be fair. So we have about 20 minutes now for the World Cafe, and I just received the suggestion to combine the World Cafe with our coffee break. So you can push your energy levels a little bit up. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna break into 3 groups, and we have 3 topics for you, which I'm going to read out. So topic number 1 is about creating structural solutions to systematic promotion of implementation. And the how do we call it, strategic or key note takers. We have 3 key note takers. One of them is Nora. I don't know where she is. Yeah, Nora. So Nora will lead the discussion and take notes here around the stage. So we're going to have 3 spaces. One of them is going to be here, another one at the back of the room in that corner, and the third one is going to be outside. So the third group will have a privileged position because it will be closer to the coffee and the sweets. Second group is about communication strategies to develop political will for the implementation, and that group is going to be led by George, whom you all know, and George's group is going to be in that corner. And the third group is about the work of the European institutions to promote the implementation, and that's Ramute's group. So you're the lucky one, closer to the coffee. Basically, the idea here is that each of you can decide which group you would like to join based on your interest. And then the key note takers will be picking your brains, listening to you and collecting your thoughts. And you're also free to jump from one group to the other if you see that it's not something that's is of interest to you, or if you think that you have already contributed to one group and you want to contribute to the other group, please feel free to do so. So we have 20 minutes. I hope I communicated everything clearly. So we have 3 groups: Nora's group here, George's group over there, and Ramute's group outside. The topics are over here. Let's enjoy the coffee and let's have some good discussion. 20 minutes.
The coffee is just outside here. You can grab some coffee and sweets outside and join your group.